Dr. Carl Trueman is a professor at Westminster. He wrote a book last year, at least it was published last year, called The Rise and the Triumph of the Modern Self. It's a fascinating book, and in some of his interviews, as well as in some of his writings, one of the points he makes is if you really want to know about the identity of a culture, a group of people, and what I mean by that is what they really think of themselves, how they identify themselves, what you need to do is not go to the university and listen to professors like him. You don't need to read the academic books. What you need to do is you need to pay attention to the arts, you need to watch the media, look at the popular movies, and listen to the lyrics of the songs. So here you go. Popular movie and popular lyrics. Frozen. Disney. Here it is. Couldn't keep it in. Heaven knows I tried. Don't let them in, don't let them see. Be the good girl that you always have to be. Conceal, don't feel, don't let them know. Well, now they know. You know, I'm going to read a few more lyrics here, but can't you feel the flavor of the lyrics so far? To conceal and not to feel is a negative thing. It's something that should be put aside. Listen to a few more of these lyrics. Let it go, can't hold back anymore, let it go. By the way, every time I read this, I keep thinking, let it be. That tells you how old I am, right? Okay, let it go, can't hold back anymore, let it go, turn away and slam the door. Boy, there's some strong emotions here, right? A little bit later on it says, it's time to see what I can do to test the limits and to break through. No right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. Let it go. Let it go. Listen, I don't know this song well. I don't know the background of this well. But I really don't think that they're trying to endorse the idea that there's no right and no wrong. But I do think they're endorsing this idea that don't you dare force your rules on me. Why? Because as a culture, we have gotten to a place where we believe, and by the way, the reason I want you to think about this with me is it's not just the culture around us. It is so ingrained, it is so innate. We have gotten to the place in our day and time now where people really think that what you really are is what you really, really feel. It's not what anybody else says. It's not because you belong to a certain family. It's not because of the job you have. It's not other people who are relying on you. No, you have to look within. You have to find yourself. Don't let anybody else tell you who you really are. This point was really brought home to me before I heard of Dr. Carl Trueman. It was brought home to me in an event that took place in February of last year, February 2022. There's a guy by the name of Joe Rogan. I don't know if you're familiar with that name or not. I don't know if you listen to this guy or not. A lot of people that I know listen to him faithfully, but you probably heard of the name because he's been in the news from time to time. This guy has like millions of followers on his podcast. Well, what happened to Joe Rogan in February of 2022? Well, people tried to cancel him. Now, you probably already know that, but just so that we're all on the same page, let me explain my terms here. To cancel somebody in our culture means to make them go away, right? Either get them fired from their job, get them dismissed from their position. If they have a show, then make them lose their show. If they are just somebody who's in the limelight, make them go away so they're not in the limelight anymore, right? A lot of people get canceled. That's the way I'm using the term. That's the way it's popularly often used in the media. To cancel somebody, make them go away. Well, what's the number one way that in our culture, in our time, in the last few years, you cancel somebody? All you have to do, it's pretty easy, all you have to do is find something that is socially unacceptable and bring it to light, right? Get a witness to say, well, I heard him say this. Get somebody else say, well, I saw him do this, or better yet, get an audio recording or a video recording of somebody saying something or doing something that culturally, right now, everybody says is unacceptable. Well, one of the biggest cultural sins, which, by the way, this is a sin in God's eyes, but one of the biggest cultural sins today is racism. Right? That's about as bad as it can possibly get. Well, you know what? They had Joe Rogan dead to rights. I mean, they had a video of him, and what he said was inexcusable. I mean, it was bad. So everybody looked at this, and they thought it was a slam dunk, right? We're going to cancel this guy. Why? Because people have brought up a lot less things that happened a long time ago, and they've gotten rid of celebrities. They've gotten CEOs fired from the company. They've gotten people dismissed. I mean, this kind of stuff works. So everybody was thinking, we're finally going to get rid of Joe Rogan. Here's the problem. He didn't go away. And listen, the commentators were all over this. I don't know if you followed this or not, but they were all over this. You know why? They were shocked. Because that's not the way it works, not in our culture. They thought they had their fingers on the pulse. They thought they understand how life works now. And if you commit one of the greatest cultural sins, you're out of here, right? Joe Rogan's not out of here. He's as popular as ever. Well, what happened? The analysts went into overtime to try to figure out what was going on. Here's the number one word. The number one word they kept coming back to. You know what? Joe Rogan was just so authentic. I want you to think about this with me for just a minute, because Joe Rogan did what other people did. When he got found out that he did something that he shouldn't do, you know what? He apologized. A whole lot of people have apologized for things that they shouldn't have done, and yet they still went away. They still lost their job. They still got canceled. Joe Rogan didn't. And so the analysts are like, okay, this person apologized, but they still got fired. This person apologized, they still lost their show. Joe Rogan apologizes, and nothing goes away. He gets more popular. Why? Well, they analyzed it, and it's nothing profound, but it is profound. They just said, he's so authentic. What do they mean? When he said, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done it, that was a stupid, bad thing to do, everybody felt like he really meant it. He's authentic. Follow me, follow me. You know why that works? You know why that tells us so much? Because Joe Rogan tapped into something that's deeper and more foundational in our culture today than even the problem of racism. He tapped into one of the deepest things, and here it is, our identity. Our identity. You know what our identity is as a culture? It's what you really, really feel. Doesn't make any difference if it lines up with anybody else. It doesn't make any difference if it goes with the norms or against the norms. As long as you are authentic and authentically really, really feel it, then that's who you are, and that's what everybody has to accept. And that is a problem, because God said that's not who you are. There are a lot of passages in the Bible that we can go to address this problem, but I want to go to the Old Testament. I want to go to the book of Exodus, and I want to tell you why I want to go to the book of Exodus. In Deuteronomy let me start with Exodus chapter 20. In Exodus chapter 20, you've got the 10 Commandments, right? Over in Deuteronomy chapter 5, you've got the 10 Commandments repeated. And in Deuteronomy chapter 5, it gives us a little more explanation associated with each of the 10 Commandments. Well, right after the third commandment, don't take the Lord's name in vain, the fourth commandment is, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And sometimes when you read Exodus chapter 20, you think, okay, remember the Sabbath day in the Old Testament, that was Saturday, right? And the reason they were supposed to do that, because God created the world in 6 days, seventh day he rested. That's why they keep the Sabbath day. Well, that's why it's the Sabbath day. That's why it's that particular day. But that was not the purpose of the Sabbath day observance. You understand what the purpose of the Sabbath day observance is, you have to go over to Deuteronomy chapter 5. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, here's what it says. It says, yes, on the seventh day, you're supposed to rest. You're supposed to set that aside. Why? Because you're supposed to remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and God rescued you with an outstretched, powerful hand. In other words, just like we gather every Sunday and remember what Jesus did on the cross, throughout the Old Testament, before the cross, God wanted his people every Sabbath day to set aside some time to remember this period of history and what went on, how God delivered them. And how did God deliver them? He used 10 plagues. And I don't have time to go into all this, but just refresh your memory with me. What was the essence of the 10 plagues? Each plague was not just God displaying his power. Wow, let me do something that you've never seen before. No, each one of the plagues was God directly attacking one of the gods of Egypt, right? So he was showing his power, but he was also showing that there is no other God. In fact, he was showing what it says in Isaiah chapter 42. I will not share my glory with another. God is God alone. And he was proving that in a powerful way, right? Well, all the plagues get up to the last plague, the 10th plague. And we're going to read in just a little bit, chapter 12, verse 12 of the book of Exodus, where it makes this statement. In the last plague, what was the last plague? That was the death of the firstborn, right? Death of the firstborn, unless you sacrificed a lamb and you took the blood of that lamb and you put it on the doorpost of your house. In that case, instead of death coming to your house and taking the firstborn, death would pass over. To remember that, they established a feast, which, by the way, everybody, didn't make any difference what tribe you lived in, you were required to come back to Jerusalem to remember this feast. I'm telling you, all the arrows are pointing at this throughout all Old Testament history because God wanted his people to understand something. And the last and final plague is the plague I want us to think about tonight. Why? Because it answers this issue of identity. They had it wrong, and God wanted to understand. And folks, we live in a world where people really have it wrong today. And you know why? Because they're looking within. It's what you really, really feel. Before I go any further, can I just say, Jeremiah says in chapter 17, verse 9, that there is nothing more deceptive than what? Do you know what this is? Your heart. What you really, really feel is really, really going to fool you and take you away from God. And by the way, it's going to ruin the life that God wants you to have. So here's what I want us to do tonight. I want us to think about the last plague. I just want us to read one verse because it tells us so much about that last plague. It's going to be Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. But I want us to ask three questions. And here are the questions. Question number one is this: why the firstborn? Why the firstborn? So important to understand. Question number two, why death? I mean, why didn't God just, give the firstborn a terrible disease so they'd, have a rash for 30 days or whatever? Why death? Doesn't that seem like over the top? Why the firstborn? Why death? And question number three is this: why was action required? All the other plagues, people sat back and watched what God did. This plague, God said, you got to do something. And if you don't do it, you're dead. Those are the three questions. Question number one, why the firstborn? Question number two, why death? Question number three, why was action required on the part of God's people? So question number one, why the firstborn? Real quick, because I really want to spend some time a little bit later on, but real quick, let's answer this question. To understand why the firstborn, the first thing that we have to clarify in our minds is in the Bible, the firstborn does not always mean the one who was born first. I want to say that one more time because to the modern listener, that's kind of scratching their heads. What do you mean? Somebody's born first, they're not the firstborn? Not necessarily. Take Abraham for an example. Abraham had a promised child. His name was Isaac. But did he have a child before he had Isaac? Yes, he did. That child's name was Ishmael. Do you remember that? So who was born first? Ishmael. Who was the firstborn? Isaac. Isaac wasn't born first, but he was the firstborn. Okay, let's go to Isaac's children. Isaac had two boys. What are their names? Jacob and Esau, right? Which one came out of the womb first? That'd be Esau. Which one was the firstborn? That would be Jacob. Are you confused? No, because you're Bible students. You understand this, right? Okay. When we talk about firstborn, we don't mean the one who was born first. That sounds strange to us because we don't understand the concept. I don't mean us. I don't mean us in the room. I'm talking about our world doesn't understand this concept. And we've got to understand the concept before we understand this last plague. What is the firstborn? Firstborn was the ancient world looking deep within themselves and saying, this is the most important thing. Because the firstborn is the child who got the double portion. And why did the firstborn get the double portion? Because mom and dad liked him most? No, had nothing to do with that. The one who got the double portion was responsible for carrying on the family name, carrying on the family business, shouldering all the responsibility. He was the one that the family totally depended upon, right? And if the one who was born first wasn't able to shoulder that responsibility, you know what they'd do? They'd make somebody else the firstborn. Because the firstborn meant all the dreams, all the hopes, all the responsibility of the family, it's on you. Okay, now having said that, let's go ahead and read Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. Because here's a summary of what just happened in chapter 11 and what's going on in chapter 12. A summary of the final plague. It says, on that same night, I'm reading verse 12 of chapter 12, on that same night, I will, God speaking here, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both of people and of animals, In fact, he's already made a statement back in chapter 11, from Pharaoh's house, that's as prestigious as you can possibly get, down to the slave girl's house, that's as low as you can possibly get. Everybody's included in this, right? So let me read this again. That night I will pass through Egypt. I will strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. Now think about that with me for just a minute. If we understand the concept of the firstborn, I think we can understand what he's saying here, because what he's saying is like the first plague, water turned to blood of the Nile. Who's that against? That's against the god of the Nile, right? Second plague, frogs. That's against a frog god that they worshiped, right? When they worshiped the sun god, God made it turn dark. You can see how each one of those relate to God defeating one of the gods of Egypt. How in the world, though, does this final plague wipe out or deal judgment on all the gods of Egypt? Here's the best way I think to understand this. In the ancient world, if somebody was in Egypt, you know why they worshiped the god of the Nile? They didn't worship the god of the Nile because they wanted to worship the god of the Nile. They worshiped the god of the Nile because they wanted water. You know why they wanted good water? They wanted good water for their family. There's nothing more important to them than their family. You know why they would worship the god of the crops? Because they wanted crops. Why did they want crops? So they could eat? No. They wanted crops so their family could eat. What I'm trying to say is this. Every god they worshiped in Egypt indirectly was really serving their number one God. And you know what their number one God was? It was their family. You know what the number one God of our world is today? It's ourselves. You know what God is bringing judgment against here? He's bringing judgment against any other God who would take his place. And he's dispelling all those gods with the death of the firstborn. He's getting at the core. I hope that makes sense, because I need to move on to question number 2. Why the firstborn? Because it's our identity. It's what's really important to us. Why death? Why death? They have this principle. They call it the measured principle. You know, you don't use a bazooka. Well, most people don't use a bazooka to kill a mosquito, right? Right? And if a hippopotamus is chasing you, you don't go out there with a fly swatter, right? Maybe you need a bazooka then. I don't know. But there's a measured response, right? Why in the world did God say the judgment on the firstborn will be death? Think about that for just a minute. This must be something pretty big. This must be something real significant, and it is. Because it's not just taking glory away from God. It's killing us. It's ruining the life that God created and ruining everything God intended for us to be when we put anything else in God's place, and especially when we put ourselves there. I want to illustrate this because I really want you to get this point. Let's see how this works in marriage first. In marriage, it's where instead of a covenant relationship, we make it into a consumer relationship. And let me explain my terms. When I'm talking about consumer relationships, what I mean is it's a cost-based analysis. I don't know how much you are as far as a consumer goes, but I'm a consumer when it comes to buying different things. And so if I buy groceries on the other side of my town, usually the reason I would drive to the other side of town is because they've got a better price or maybe they've got a better product. But if there was a store that was closer to my house and they're selling the exact same thing or maybe even something a little bit better, and the price is a little bit cheaper and the people are a little bit nicer, guess what? I'm not going across town anymore. I'm going to this new store. Why? I'm a consumer, right? But by the way, I'm not against consumerism at all in the marketplace. I think it works well. Problem is when we bring consumerism into relationships. You know what we've done? Because we're so focused on ourselves, our culture, there's nothing more important than the way I really feel, that even marriages end up being consumer-based relationships. You know what that looks like? You're probably miles ahead of me, but let me go ahead and illustrate it. Let's say we've got a guy and his name's Ralph. And let's say he's young and he falls in love with this lady named Barbara. Why? Because he finds her beautiful. right? She laughs at his jokes. She respects him. He enjoys conversing with her, and she looks great to him, right? So eventually they get a little bit closer, and Ralph and Barbara, that's the names I used, right? Ralph and Barbara, they end up getting married. But in our day and age, here's what happens. A few years pass. Barbara doesn't look the way she used to. She's not laughing at his jokes anymore, doesn't seem to respect him, and they just don't seem to talk the way they used to talk. No more communication like they used to have, like he used to so enjoy. And here's the extra problem. At work, Ralph met this young lady named Susan. And Susan's still really pretty, right? And Susan laughs at his jokes, and she really respects him. And he finds it so easy to talk with her. So you know what Ralph says? Ralph says, you know what? I'm putting so much into this relationship. I'm not getting anything out of it. Here's another relationship. I think I'm done with this relationship, and I'm on to the next. And you know what? Most people in our world today understand that. They're like, yeah, sure, I see that. You know why? Because people think of relationships as consumer relationships. And you know what? You probably already understand this, but here's a point I want to make. It's the worst thing you can possibly do for yourself. It's not only the worst thing you can possibly do in a marriage, it's the worst thing you can possibly do for yourself. And I want to illustrate this by pointing to a guy. He's a clinical psychologist, and he's not even a Christian. He's a clinical psychologist, but he studies relationships all the time, especially marriages. He used to teach at Harvard University. Before that, he taught at a university in Toronto. And a lot of his class lectures are online. And one of these class lectures, I was fascinated to listen to this. This guy's not a Christian, but he's talking about Christian principles in marriage without even realizing it, right? And he's talking to university students, and he's trying to convince them not to be consumers when it comes to their close relationships, especially marriage. This whole idea, you know, whatever I get out of it, if I'm not getting much out of it, I'm done with that relationship, and I'm on to another relationship. He's trying to tell these students that's the worst possible thing you can do. And the students aren't hearing it, right? Because the students just simply want to, you know, this person gives me what I'm looking for, and that's where I'm at, right? And if somebody else gives me what I'm looking for better than this person, I'm done with that person, I'm on to the next person. That's the way the students are living their lives. And this professor is trying to explain to them, that's the worst thing you can possibly do for yourself. And here's why. If you have a consumer-based marriage, for example, if you have a consumer-based marriage, you will never become the person you can become. And here's why. Because you will, consciously or subconsciously, you will never totally open up and be transparent and deal with stuff that you need to deal with in your life with the person who's closest to you. You'll never really do that. And you know why you won't do that? Because deep down, whether you realize it or not, you're afraid that if they really see who you really are, and they see some of those dark corners and some of those issues I've got in my life, if they see that, they'll leave me and they'll go on to somebody else. Because you assume they're going to treat it like a covenant, not a covenant relationship, but a consumer relationship, just like you are. And because of that, your relationship will forever be shallow, and you will never develop into the kind of person you could be if you had a relationship with somebody where you said something like, in sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow, in adversity and prosperity, it doesn't make any difference. Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. You can count on me. I'm not going anywhere. Doesn't make any difference if you don't look like you used to look. Doesn't make any difference if everything's changed, your personality's changed. I am here and I'm not going anywhere. You know what? You have that kind of relationship in a marriage, you will flourish as an individual, and you will experience a relationship deeper than you could ever experience if you just went out and constantly looked for the person who's most going to satisfy you. You know what? God calls that a covenant relationship. Maybe you get that in marriage. But let's go a little bit further, because this is a big deal. We allow self to influence our relationships. We become consumers in our relationships. You know what it does? It doesn't just ruin marriages, it ruins friendships. I don't know if you've seen the statistics on this. Do you realize the average American has less close friends than they've ever had in the history of America? Especially adult men. Adult men many times can't name more than 2 people they consider real, genuine friends. Oh, I wish I had time to talk about this. I just want to give you the backdrop. You know what created this monster? It's something so deep in our culture, we don't even realize it. It's because we care nothing more than what I really, really feel. And so I even treat my friendships like it's a consumer relationship. If this guy I have a friendship with, right? If he sucks the life out of me, you heard somebody say something like that, right? They suck the life out of me every time. I can't handle that. I can't handle all the drama. I'm on to somebody else. If you have that consumer attitude in your friendships, you'll never have close friendships. You got to get to the point, yeah, sure, sometimes you're going to get some stuff out of the relationship. You'll be blessed by it. But you have to have the attitude, you know what? Whether I like this or not, I'm not going anywhere. I'm committed to you, and you can count on me. Do you see this? You know what happens to the church? People treat the church like a consumer relationship. Oh, I like this one. I get a lot out of it. It's cost-based analysis. I like the guy. He's funny. Whatever. But there's another church closer to my house. That guy's a little funnier. The service is a little shorter. I enjoy it a little bit more. I'm leaving that church. I'm going to that church. Does that ever happen with people when they attend churches? Please don't misunderstand me. I really do think we have to make some judgments, especially about what churches teach. But if a group of people are committed to following God and His Word, you know what a church really needs? It needs people who say, even if I don't like it, through thick and thin, in sickness and in health, when I like it and when I don't, you can count on me. I'm not going anywhere. Man, if we had covenant relationships, if we did what God wanted us to do, regardless of how we felt, do you know how that would change lives? You know how it'd change us? Do you understand why God killed the firstborn? Because whatever you put in front of God ruins life, ruins everything. So why the firstborn? Because it's the way they really, really felt. Why death? Because it's that serious. Why was action required? I hope you're already connecting the dots here. Why was action required? I want to give you the illustration first, and then I'm going to go to the scripture, okay? Illustration, again, it's Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you're familiar with this guy or not. He's a practicing clinical psychologist. He's got a pretty impressive background. He interviews people all the time. He was interviewing a woman from Great Britain. She started a foundation, and this foundation was advocating evidence-based healthcare. Isn't that a fascinating thought? Evidence-based healthcare in Great Britain. And they had some notoriety. They were in the press. And as a result of that, Jordan Peterson decides to interview her. Well, in the middle of this, I don't know, about an hour and 40-minute interview, she brings up a very, very interesting case. She says, and she's talking about Great Britain, but this could go for Western culture at large. She says, parents have gotten to the place where instead of parenting their children, many parents feel like they need to be a counselor to their children. And so here's the scenario she gave. She said, a typical parent, at least in Great Britain, if little Johnny, grade school age child, gets hurt on the playground and somebody pushes him and he falls down, he scrapes his knee. And Johnny comes home. Most parents, she says, most parents say, Johnny, how did you feel when you got pushed down? Doesn't that just sound like a counselor? How did you feel when that happened, right? And both Peterson and this lady were saying, that is the worst possible thing a parent can say. You know why? There's several reasons. Reason number one is because a little grade school kid doesn't know how he feels. He's still processing his thoughts, and the job of a parent is help him to understand how he should have appropriate emotions and how he should feel. So what should a parent say when something like that happens? Instead of asking little Johnny how you felt, a parent should say, Johnny, what did you do? What did you do? When that happened, did somebody do it on purpose? Did you get in a fight? Did they apologize? Was it an accident? Did they ask for forgiveness? Did you forgive them? Did they run away? Tell me what happened and tell me what you did. And then you process what they did in order for them to grow, right? You focus on the action. But that's not what we're doing as a culture. As a culture, what we're doing is we're asking children how they feel all the time. And at a subconscious level, we're emphasizing the idea that there's nothing more important than how you feel. And you know what happens? Let me just be blunt with this. Little Johnny one day feels like he's little Julie. And because of that, parents say, well, you must be. Because there's nothing more important than how you feel. I'm not trying just to pick on the trans issue. I'm saying this raises its ugly head in many different categories of life. And we've already lost the battle because our basis is our feeling instead of doing what God says. Do you understand this? Here's the scripture. It's Genesis chapter 4, verse 6. It's the first counseling session of the Bible. The first counseling session of the Bible, God is the counselor. And the patient is a guy named Cain. And God comes to Cain and he says, Cain, why do you feel so bad? Why is your countenance fallen? If you do what is right, will not your countenance be lifted? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? Here's God's advice. Do the right thing, and life will work the way it's supposed to work. But if you rely on your feelings, listen to what else God says. He says, Cain, if you don't, sin's right around the corner. It's waiting at the door, and it's going to get you. And it's gotten us. You know who you are? It's not what you really, really feel. Who you are is what you do. And that's why we do what God says to do. You know, yesterday a couple times, you were told I would never ask you to stand up. But nobody said I wouldn't ask you to raise your hand. And I need to know before I go any further, how many of you have already been immersed into Christ? Wow, that's wonderful. I got something to say to you. If you're an immersed believer in Christ, are you a consumer? Are you a committed covenant follower of Christ? Through thick and thin, in sickness and health, in joy and sorrow, not just with people, but with God's people, with His church. Have you made the commitment to say, regardless of what happens, you can count on me? Is there anybody here thinking about being baptized who has not yet been baptized into Christ? You know, one of the things that, as a preacher, just being honest with you, I would love to tell people, all you got to do is bow your head. Nobody will see you. Say a prayer. Repeat these words after me, and you'll be okay. But the sinner's prayer, it's not in the Bible. Jesus says in Matthew the 10th chapter, if you want me to confess you before the Father in heaven, you have to confess me before men. It says in Mark chapter 16, verse 16, if you believe and are baptized, you will be saved. We have a commitment to God. We have a commitment to our church, don't we? And we have a commitment to our world. Because they need to find out who they really are. And they don't know. Because they don't know what God's asking. But we'll tell them, won't we?